Hello, my name is Dr. Guzel Hill, and this is the video abstract for my article, Categories of the Art of the Impossible. National uniform legislation connects the federal distribution of powers that has been achieved 120 years ago to the challenges and opportunities Australia faces today. Developing and drafting national uniform legislation has been described as the art of the impossible, and yet we need it more than ever because it regulates such important areas as search for cure for cancer, money laundering, corporations. Many things that used to be impossible became possible. Putting the man on the moon, first air flight, spray on skin. What if drafting of national uniform legislation can become possible? And we can use it for important reforms, such as regulation of domestic violence, social enterprise structures, and defamation. As a lawyer who was first trained in civil law jurisdiction, I retained my love and passion for legislation. I discovered my love for national uniform legislation when I started working at Parliamentary Council as a legislative drafter. Previous research looked at how harmonization fails. It's time to look at what actually works. There are close to 100 sets of uniform acts, and lawyers over the years looked at legislation through microscope to see each particular act in isolation. Now, with the number of sets of uniform acts, it's time to take a medium range telescope and look at bigger picture for patterns, links, and general theory. There are 4 pathways that explain how national uniform legislation works. 3 ways take us to uniformity, and 4th way is the way uniformity is blocked. First one, incremental development through cycles. Good example is corporations legislation. In 1860s, jurisdictions used to model legislation from UK. In 1960s, Australian jurisdictions enact their own mirror legislation. In 1980s, with the growth of economy, Australian jurisdictions enact legislation in the applied structure. And in 2001, legislation is enacted in the most rigid referred structure. Second way is the multiple streams framework. That is when legislation is elevated to the national reform almost overnight. Good example is counter-terrorism legislation. After attacks of 9/11, legislation became uniform across Australian jurisdictions within 2 years. Pragmatic federalism solution is when jurisdictions take a shortcut. Good example is cross-border justice legislation. That was enacted to regulate community that is on the border between Northern Territory, South Australia, and Western Australia. This mirror legislation did not enact new substantial law, but it allowed judges and police officers to exercise their jurisdictions across the border. 4th way is advocacy coalition framework. It helps us explain how uniformity attempts are blocked. Good example is road rules. Calls for harmonization have been heard as early as 1930s, when we still had horse carriages. After numerous attempts, financial incentives, legislation is still not uniform. The model uncovers general principles and brings order to what has long been described the art of the impossible.